So you're actually, scientific management hasn't changed. So I don't think human beings are necessarily less systemized. In fact, I think they are more systemized. People will default to the system because it's easier, it's safer, it's less risk averse. We want people to just follow a process. But if we wanted people to follow a process, how do we also get them to actually think independently? How do we get them to show autonomy? There's no research anywhere in the world that demonstrates that performance reviews increase performance. So the question is, well, why are we doing it then?
One of the best parts of running a remote podcast is that I can easily connect with interesting people around the world. And this week's guest joins me in sunny Miami Beach, Florida, USA from Australia. On this week's episode of the Senise podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Tim Baker, a globally recognized leadership expert, award-winning author, and founder of Winners at Work. With a passion for transforming workplace culture and unlocking human potential, Dr. Baker brings decades of experience in helping leaders shift from outdated performance management to dynamic, strength-based leadership. His career spans 14 countries and 21 industries. He's delivered over 2,400 seminars, workshops, keynotes, and coaching programs, impacting more than 45,000 leaders and professionals worldwide. Get ready for a conversation packed with real-world strategies and thought-provoking insights that can transform how you lead and work. Take a listen. Dr. Tim Baker, thank you for joining us today on this episode of the Senise podcast. We are in our first wave of episodes. The goal was 8. You are our 8th guest filmed. So, thanks to you, we are able to meet our target, and we will be launching July 2nd. So I thank you very much for your graciousness with your time. I know you're a very busy man, traveling the world, teaching and training. And I commend you for your work. I think it's excellent. And I feel that I have a lot in common with you simply because I've overseen HR for many, many years. We've talked about how human capital is not I don't think it's a kind term. I think it's very mechanical. And you've talked about how much things have changed since the Industrial Revolution. You've also talked about what's changed in the work environment since the Ford assembly lines were created. Can you tell me a little bit about what those things have meant in your career?
Yeah, well, Chris, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And I think that, lots of things have changed since Henry Ford put his assembly line out, and and that was a huge breakthrough because that was the start of scientific management. And that's where they chopped up the assembly line and made sure that every single thing that happened in terms of creating a car was systemized. So it meant that the efficiencies were put in place and people had to do things a certain way. But what's really changed? Has it really changed? I mean, you've got your franchise systems now, McDonald's, all of these franchise systems. The whole purpose of the McDonald's is when you buy a franchise or any of those food chains, what you're actually doing is you're buying a system. So you're actually, scientific management hasn't changed. So we've got these terms, human capital and human resources. We're still using those terms. So I'm very concerned that things haven't changed in that sense. So I don't think human beings are necessarily less systemized. In fact, I think they are more systemized. I mean, you've had the experience, I've had the experience. You go to a motel, you ask for something unusual, and they freeze because they're trying to find the manual to tell them what to say or what to do. So it really does concern me that things haven't changed that much, really. It's just that we're using different systems. I think that's the point I'd make there. But human capital is a kind of derogatory term because it's kind of suggesting that, people are like a photocopier or, they're a Xerox machine, I think you
Mhm.
call it over there. And obviously the heart and soul of any business is the people. I mean,
Mhm.
without that, you're in strife. So I'm a little skeptical, Chris, about whether things have changed much over 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 100 years. It's been over 100 years since Henry Ford's assembly line. So I wonder, it does concern me that human capital and human resources and all these terms are still being used when we're really talking about people.
Mhm. And there's been I've seen you talk about also how there's been a transformation from the employee side probably since around the 80s, the 90s. You've been in this space for over 20 years. What have you seen evolve just in those 20 years, right? Factoring in the Ford factories and the Industrial Revolution, what have you seen evolved just in 20 years?
Well, I'm saying a lot of things, but really it's just that the systems that we're using now are different. And the other thing that's interesting is that those systems that I've been talking about, they go right across the board. If you look at, for example, the medical profession, there's certain things that have to be done, certain protocols that have to be followed. So what I think has changed is actually that we've become more systemized. And in one of my books, I call this the dumbing down of work. So
Mhm,
people come in and they're trained and locked into a system. So the thing that I have noticed is prudent independent judgment is not something that happens much in any business because people aren't trained that way, but yet everybody talks about being creative and innovative.
mhm,
They talk about continuous improvement, but at the end of the day, people have got a choice. They've got a choice between following a system and not following a system and showing prudent independent judgment. And if I've got a choice between those two things, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to follow the system because if anything goes wrong, I can blame the system. And so what I find, and it's not necessarily a positive thing, is that whilst all the rhetoric is around, we want people to come to work, bring their brains to work, don't leave them in a paper bag at the doorway. The reality is we are more systemized now, perhaps, than we ever were before, because we want people to just follow a process. But if we're wanting people to follow a process, how do we also get them to actually think independently? How do we get them to show autonomy? I think that's something that isn't really, we're not doing that very well at all. And I feel that in many ways we're locked into that assembly line mentality to a point where people aren't willing to show prudent independent judgment. That worries me greatly because show me any organization and I'll show you an organization that has a value around innovation and continuous improvement.
mhm.
But yet the people who are best positioned to be able to make those judgments are the people who are at the source. They're doing the job, but yet they're being told that they have to follow systems, processes, and procedures first and foremost. So it's a real problem, I think.
Yeah, and I can think about several places I've worked at where there's preaching culture and then there's the real culture. My term for a culture that is preached but dysfunctional, right? It's feels like words. It's not really being there's still some level of exploiting employees versus valuing their contributions, their creativity, their actual innovation, even treating the business as of its own. I
Yes.
usually call that a phony culture. Like there's really no other way for me to refer to that. And the further along the chain you get, you think you have better visibility into that, only to find out that the wool's pulled over your eyes as well. And you've been party to pushing the culture that's actually dysfunctional. Um, and so when you're in that position as a manager, you want to push that culture down and people just don't buy into it. And I see that more and more, even in some of the leadership development courses that we're leading through my own practice, that will talk to either frontliners or maybe that middle management, where they're saying that's what they want us to say, but that's not what they mean. And there's a real disparity between what business owners are saying and what they're expecting.
I think you've articulated it perfectly. And then we're expecting people to come to work and to be innovative. Well, it's a huge risk to do that because they've been trained not to do that. Yet the manager stands up in the meeting and says, we want you to bring your ideas to work. We want you to be innovative. So all the rhetoric is there. That's what you're saying. But on the other hand, if you go outside the prescribed way of doing things, you're going to be criticized. And quite frankly, there's a risk involved with that. That worries me greatly. So leaders are challenged with the idea of how do we get people to bring their creativity to work, I think.
Right, because we are, you know, a sum of that. Without contributions, you're very limited. And you know, being able to create a platform where people feel comfortable in sharing their ideas. And I'm not even talking about being shot down, because again, you can say whatever you want in a boardroom, but truly not taking ideas and rolling with them. I think people actually, they pick up on that. They know when they're being asked to bring ideas and then just being ignored. When you talk about being worried, where does that worry lead you? What is it that you foresee?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me give you a little example because I think your viewers and listeners are thinking, well, what's an example of that? I was doing a job in Southeast Asia, so I was actually overseas doing a presentation, series of presentations. I was staying at a five-star hotel, and it was a magnificent hotel. Everything on it was there, it was wonderful. And I went to one of the restaurants. There were five restaurants that were attached to the hotel. And so I had the most magnificent meal I've ever had, Thai meal. And I just love Thai food. So
Mm.
it was just to die for. And I came out of the restaurant and actually took with me a menu. And I went up to the reception. So you had to walk past the reception from this restaurant. And the receptionist was beaming with a smile, and she said, "Hello, Dr. Baker. How did you enjoy your meal?" I said, "Absolutely loved it. And I wondered if you can do me a favor." And she said, "Of course." So, everything's good so far. And I had in my hand the menu. And I said, "Look, I've had the most magnificent Thai meal I have ever eaten anywhere in the world. And I'm wondering if I could get the recipe and take it home because my wife loves to cook and I'd like to eat this again." And all the blood drained out of her face. It was like panic. And I could see that she wanted to reach under the reception and try and find the manual to find out what to do in this situation, which of course is a rather unique situation. And she panicked and said, "Look, I have to get my supervisor. I don't know I can't answer this." So in walked the supervisor. And of course, I explained the same thing. I said, "Look, I've had this magnificent meal, blah, blah, blah. And can you give me a menu?" And he started to panic and he invited his manager in. So here am I talking to three levels of management and I just wanted the menu. I just wanted the recipe for this menu. And look, I'm not suggesting for a minute that that's not an unusual request. Of course it is. But the very fact that they weren't able to deal with that just shows you how systemized it is. And this is a five-star hotel. Now, the good news is I actually did end up getting the menu, but the point of the exercise was that these people were really, really hamstrung by systems, processes, and procedures. And it just wasn't in the training. So, so I missed out. But, it took me a long time to get there, but I finally got there. So that I just wanted to give an example of that. But it does worry me, coming back to your question, it worries me because managers are also concerned about this. And the question then is, how do managers actually instill this autonomy and independent judgment? I say prudent independent judgment because we don't want people just running off and doing whatever they want to do.
Sure.
That's not going to work. That's not going to fly. So we actually want people to actually think for themselves in the right place at the right time in the right way. But managers are in a dilemma between wanting people to follow systems and also that. So that worries me. My, I'm sure we'll get to solutions around that shortly. But of course, as I said earlier, they have a choice, people, and they will follow the system because it's safe. And that's the worry. There's a risk. There's a risk for the leader and there's a risk for the employee. So therefore, we have these kinds of interactions that I just explained when I was in Thailand, where, you just don't get something that's a little bit outside the box. And
Mhm.
it's a problem because, people these days, they've got opportunities, they've got options. They can go to this restaurant or they can go to that motel or they can go to this practitioner. So, the customer wants to be treated uniquely. Of course, we all know that, and yet they're being homogenized and processed through systems. So that's what worries me about it all.
Right. And that brings me to, you know, us becoming very mechanical. And I'm sure this has happened to you before where you are going somewhere and you're the customer and you need something, and the response from a clerk or whoever it is that you're dealing with is, well, I don't know what to tell you. This is what the computer tells me.
Yeah.
That's what the computer says. And I'm thinking, maybe the solution is giving employees parameters as to where their autonomy lies. And, when you've got a customer, especially in front of you, but when you've got a customer, trying to resolve for them in some way versus here's yes I can, no I can't, and if it's no I can't, it's because the computer tells me, and if it's yes I can, it's because the computer tells me. That takes me Your experience at this restaurant takes me to the very few businesses I believe are executing on this, and it makes me think of the Ritz-Carlton and how they give some of, housekeeping. This is These are your parameters for autonomy. Just
Yes.
make sure you resolve quickly, the customer's happy, and I understand that there are different levels of autonomy that can be granted, but why do you think some businesses get it and others don't?
Well, it gets to the solution to the problem. I think one of the things I'd say to your viewers and listeners is if you're looking at practical ways of dealing with this, good leaders will do exactly what you said. They will articulate clearly where autonomy is appropriate. So, for
Mhm.
example, you might, and I talk about this in one of my books, where you actually get your team together and you say to your team, right, and you draw a couple of lines down a whiteboard, and then on the left hand side you say to your team, right, what are all the things that we do day to day that have to follow processes and procedures and systems? And you
Yeah.
write all the things down on the left hand side, and of course that's not going to be a difficult question. Everyone's going to be able to answer that. And then you say, right, let's go to the far column. So the column on the right hand side would be what, where can we show autonomy? Where can we show prudent independent judgment? And then, that's going to be a bit more difficult, but you do persevere and write some things down about scenarios and situations where it would be appropriate to use your own judgment. And then in the middle column, you have situations that could either be situations where you could follow systems, or you could have situations where people could decide to do things their own way. Now, it's the middle column that's the problem. because where it's very obvious where you've got to show independent judgment, people will do that. But where it's in the middle, where it's gray area, where I could actually follow a system or I could actually, make the decision myself, people will default to the system because it's easier, it's safer, it's less risk averse. And so because of that, so by doing that exercise with your team, you are articulating your own vision about where it's okay to actually make your own judgment calls. Now, leaders often don't do that. And then in a one-on-one conversation, of course, you can follow that up and you can start to encourage people to actually show independent judgment. You could actually do that exercise one-on-one. So the answer for leaders is they need to spend time, effort, and energy talking about the difference between systemization and actually autonomy. If they don't do that, then the employee is going to be confused. And if they're confused, they're going to follow a system.
Agreed. One of the experiences that I've had with direct reports has been to not answer their questions. So, I'll give you a brief example. I'm not ignoring them, but perhaps in a one-on-one or when they come to me, I am just, and you may or may not agree with this, but I will respond to a question with a question because I would say 9 times out of 10, they have an answer. They have an idea as to what to do next, but they're looking for the reassurance. They're looking
Yes.
for that safety net of, I'm not going to get in trouble if I'm within those 2 columns you're talking about. And I find that if I just press them with questions, we end up with, "See, you didn't know what to do." And perhaps you have to tweak along the way. Maybe they get most of their the response correct, but the reason I do that as well is not just to improve their confidence, but also to keep them from thinking that they have to ask me everything. Because if I'm getting asked every 5 minutes, "What do I do? What do I do? What do I do?" then the only thing they'll know how to do is ask me what to do. Um,
Exactly.
and and I'm not sure. I've had really good mentors throughout the years, I really have, and I've worked with
Yes.
some fantastic people that just did that with me, and I grew, I expanded, and my confidence increased.
Yep.
But I worry sometimes that managers are put in place perhaps for all the wrong reasons, or you're not training the trainer, right? The person who's going to be working with those direct reports. Perhaps it's a rite of passage because
Yeah.
they've been in their role for a long time and it's the logical next step to put them in a management position. But do you work with clients in determining who would be the right person to put
Yeah,
in those roles?
absolutely.
Mhm,
Chris, I think I think you've hit the nail on the head. If leaders are not in the business of answering questions, leaders are in the business of asking questions.
mhm,
Now, this is very difficult for leaders because all of the training, anyone that's done any tertiary education, anyone gone to university, they've done a trade, whatever it might be, the whole purpose of education is to teach people how to answer questions.
mhm,
So what happens is that these people are then promoted into a leadership role and they're working on the assumption that I'm actually here to answer questions. Now, this is a problem because as soon as you answer the question, you've made that person dependent on you.
mhm,
Okay. So what I would suggest is that the leader actually, say you come to me and you want reassurance, you want to know the answer. Well, the best way I can reassure you is not to say, yes, go ahead and do it. Because if I did that, you're now dependent on me. So you're going to come to me every single time because you know that I'm going to respond to that. Instead of doing that, what I should do is say, well, what do you think? You know, if I wasn't here, what would you do? or something like that. And I think there are four key questions you can ask people. The first one is, what are you trying to achieve? Because if people haven't got a clarity around what the outcome is, well, that's a problem. So we need to be clear about what they're trying to achieve. The second question is, what are the barriers getting in the way? Because obviously you're coming to me because there's barriers. What are those barriers? And, they could be very simple things, but there are barriers. The third question is, what are your options? That's the money question. What are your options? You'll notice it's plural. So I'm actually asking people to give me more than one option. So they say, oh, well, I was thinking of doing this. And you say, okay, what else could you do? And you get a couple of different responses. Now, that's hard for a leader because they already know what the answer is. Why can't they just give them the answer? Well, the reason is very simple. We don't want that person to be dependent on you as a leader.
Right.
And the final question is, what do you need to do next? So by the time that person walks away, so you talk to me, I've asked you these four questions, you're reassured because you've thought, I've got you thinking, and you have actually got a plan of action. And I haven't given you any of that. It's come out of your head. And my job is to extract that from you and feed it back to you. That's the answer to this. It's not, so as I said earlier, leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. And I think if leaders can understand that,
Mhm.
they're going to be, because when you ask someone a question, as you're asking me, you're driving the agenda where you want it to go. And a leader is not, so if I just sit there and answer a question, it might be the wrong question. So no matter how good my answer is, it's not a very effective way of interacting. So that's why feel very strongly about the whole idea of leadership conversations. And it's all about getting the person on the receiving end to get them to think a little bit more autonomously. So I think that's the way forward.
I'd agree with that. Um, I always think about, when I was in CFO roles, how limited my time was
Yeah.
and how much I needed to depend on my team. Not the other way around, right? I needed to be
Yes.
briefed on things. But I have a very distinct memory of when I was the first time I was in a CFO role, new to the role, having a conversation with the CEO and asking him a very specific finance question. And of course, once you're in C-suite, the conversations are very different. They're much more direct. Nobody has time for hand holding. Everyone needs to own their role. And I asked him a very specific finance question, and his response was, "Why are you asking me? How would I know that?" And it pushed me into a scary position of, what if I do something wrong? This is his business, right?
Yeah.
But then also recognizing that my role was important, right? I served a purpose there, and part of that purpose was to alleviate him. That was such a lesson to me because once I had that sort of epiphany, it helped me operate differently with my team.
Yeah.
It helped me recognize that I need to be alleviated and not have people constantly coming to me. And so in these these one-on-ones that we would have, right? And you've talked about this as well, right? That the one-on-ones are not supposed to be necessarily about work. It's more about just having conversations and stuff. But I would share that with my team and I'd be like, remember, you're here, you're an important part of this puzzle, and everyone has to be helping each other. And then, that
Mm.
was one conversation. And then another conversation was about work. And then the other conversation was about family and what's going on in your world. You are a big fan of conversations.
Absolutely.
Let's get
Yeah.
into conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think, you asked earlier about what good leaders do, and I can say this for sure, that anyone that's a really good leader, regardless of the industry, is having regular what I would call catch-ups with their team members. And these catch-ups are not about talking about the projects. It's actually about the employee and the working relationship. In the States, a colleague of mine, Jim Kuzner, wrote a great book called Credibility. And the very first chapter in that book, magic title, Leadership is a Relationship. Now, it's not a personal relationship, obviously, or shouldn't be, but it's a working relationship. And then it prompts the question, how does anyone have a relationship with anybody? And the answer is one conversation at a time. If you think about it, there is no other way of doing it. Sure, you can text people, you can send emails, you can do all this, but at the end of the day, it's one conversation at a time. And so this is why I'm a fan of the conversation, because it brings back the humanity into the workplace. It also builds and the research bears this out, that if you are in a good working relationship with your team members, engagement goes up, trust goes up, autonomy goes up, all the good things happen. And so, but leaders will often say to me, and I'm sure you hear it as well, leaders say, "Oh, I don't have time for all these catch-ups. I'm too busy getting the service out the door, the product out the door."
Mhm.
What are they really saying? That, that the people are a secondary, coming back to what we're talking about human capital, where it's a secondary consideration. And yet you can have a really great conversation in 20 minutes. You don't need 2 hours. And in fact, we've been in conversations for an hour and we can't wait for it to finish. And we've also had wonderful exchanges with people that might go for 20 minutes. So I'm suggesting 20 minutes once a month is a reasonable investment of time, effort, and energy for a leader to sit down with their direct reports. And it's not chit chat. It's not just talking about the weather at one end of the scale, but at the other end of the scale, it's not talking about the project, because you're already doing that. If you're not doing that, then no one knows what's going on anyway. It's about the actual individual's development. And all good leaders do this, Chris, without a doubt. And maybe they might not call it those things, but that's what they do. They have these regular catch ups.
And that's great for engagement, absolutely. What kind of, other than "I don't have time," what sort of pushback have you heard from other leaders, right? There's always time is limited, but what else do you hear from leaders resisting? Because there are some, public leaders that you'll hear them say, "I don't have one-on-ones with anyone."
Mm.
And that really contradicts the need, right, that we're talking about to have catch-ups, one-on-ones. What else have you heard? What are the
Yeah,
other excuses?
yeah, I've had some I mean, of course, I do a lot of executive coaching, so I actually get a
Mhm.
chance to sit down with leaders and talk, so they're not part of a group. And I can tell you now, and this surprised me somewhat, that a lot of them are terrified. They're terrified of opening up. They're terrified of showing their vulnerability. They're terrified of the exchange. Some of them don't even know how to have conversations, which is surprising. And that's why we've got all these courses out there on how to have conversations. And the funny thing is, if your parents were alive today and you went home in the evening and you said to your parents, "Hey, guess what we did today? We had a full day workshop on how to have a conversation," they would laugh their head off. That'd be the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. So we've moved beyond that. And a lot of leaders don't feel comfortable, because if you think about the word conversation, what does it imply? Two people on equal footing exchanging ideas. This goes against the grain of what a traditional leader might think is their role, that I'm the boss and I'm here to direct, I'm here to provide strategy, I'm here to answer questions, as we've talked about. So what goes to the heart of this is, what's the leader's role? So I find the ones that have a lot of trouble with this will often not understand the value and not know how to go about doing this. I think they're the two pushbacks I get. But I'll only get those one-on-one. I'll never get them in a workshop because it doesn't sound great, does it? If you actually say, I'm scared of having a conversation and opening up, I don't want to appear vulnerable, or, my job is to just set the direction. It's not about having these exchanges. So they're to me, they're the two big ones, apart from the fact that we don't have time. In fact, I don't think the time one's real. I think this is just an excuse because if people actually knew how effective this was, then they would be doing it in terms of the success. It's like investing. When you invest in something, you grumble a little bit and say, oh, I'm putting my money into something. I could be going out to dinner. I could be spending on this and that, but I'm investing it. But of course, 3 or 4 years later, assuming it's a good investment, you never regret doing that. And conversations are exactly the same thing, I would suggest.
Right, and conversations are exchanges, right? They go back and forth.
Correct.
It's I've always found it very effective to share about myself. Um, it can sometimes be difficult for, your direct reports to see you in your role and ever believe you were anywhere else. It's kind of like with your children. They believe you were born grown, right? They can't imagine you being 5, 10 years old. Um, what makes it, I think, a little easier um, in my profession has been that specifically with accounting, it's very hierarchical, right?
Mm,
Most
mm,
people can start at clerical roles or junior roles and then just work their way up. The roles don't change much whether you're in public accounting or in industry accounting. Um, and so it's easy for me to explain myself sometimes in terms of like, yeah, when I was a junior, I remember seeing such and such thing. And I think that those exchanges at a very layman level, I guess if you want to use that term, can also be really effective in these conversations. Would you recommend that as well?
absolutely, yeah. Because we've just been talking about the hang-ups that leaders have about this. What about the
Mhm.
person on the receiving end of the conversation? Some of them probably think that their job is just to follow directions and just do what they're told and not buck the system or whatever it might be. But, at the end of the day, if you chip away and you have these regular catch-ups, sooner or later a new relationship develops, a collaboration develops, and a new understanding develops, an insight develops. And so when people start they're doing these catch-ups, the first one is like pulling teeth. It's very painful, but it doesn't seem to be natural. But after a while, it becomes natural. And then we develop a collaborative working relationship, not an adversarial relationship. So since the Industrial Revolution, it's been a them and us culture where, the boss makes the decisions, the person follows through on that. And that's been around for well over 200 years. And there are still organizations and still leaders and particular employees who still think that this is a them and us type of scenario. So if we come back the full circle and say, how do we get people to be innovative? Well, the very first thing we need to do is to change the culture and break it down from a them and us to a collaborative culture where I'm still the boss. I still can make unilateral decisions when I need to. Of course, everyone knows that, everyone expects that, but I also want my people involved in the decision making process as well. So, and the conversation, I believe that when you think about it, culture, people talk about culture. What is it? I think it's the quality of conversation that goes on in the workplace. To me, it's as literally that simple, in the sense that if you want to improve a culture in an organization, it's not the 8 steps of this and the 10 steps of that. All those things, people get, oh, it's just too hard. Let's just continue. It's actually about changing the quality of conversation. And every single day, there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, depending on the size of the business, conversations going on every day. Some are going on in the boardroom, some are going on in the lunchroom, some are going on in the bathroom, some are going on in the car park. So at the end of the day, these are conversations going on all the time. So if we want to change that, then let's change the quality of conversation. Where does that start? Catch-ups, one-on-one interaction. And so if every leader in an organization sits down and has regular catch-ups with their team members, the culture will change. The culture will change and it'll become more collaborative. That, I think, is the way to look at it.
Excellent. How much do you believe the digital world has changed our ability to have these conversations? Because I think about what my day is like, and I'm having conversations like this. There are text messages, there are instant messages, there's email, there are just so many forms of communication where things can really be disruptive. And because you're not seeing the person, you're not using words right, there isn't a flow of a conversation. How disruptive do you think that is to what
I
you're talking
think
about?
it's yeah, look, I think it's quite a paradox because we're living in a world where we can have, not, I'm not saying we should, but we do have conversations via text. We do have conversations via email. We do have conversations by a range of different things. And so, in one sense, we're still having conversations. We're not doing it the right way. I mean, email is asynchronous. When you send a message to someone, they're supposed to answer it when they're ready to answer it, not just because you've asked the question. But
Mhm,
I think the whole human, the human dimension is that we are social creatures, so we like to interact. And I believe that the conversation, like we're having today, is even more important than it ever was before because we've got all of these other things in the way. And that's why I'm suggesting we down tools once a month and have regular catch ups. Now, I know that some of your listeners would, they might have remote teams and they think, well, how can I do that? Well, the same way we're doing it today, you do it online. And
mhm,
so the beautiful thing about this is we have the technology now to be able to do this. Yet we're not using the technology the way we should. And this is a problem. So it's kind of paradoxical that we can contact anyone in the world in a split second now, but yet we
mhm,
don't know who our neighbors are anymore. We don't know who the owner of the corner store is. We don't know any of these things because we're so caught up in our technological world. So I'm suggesting that perhaps the need to have the catch-ups is actually more important now to bring out that humanity than it ever was before. So I think it's just about carving out time, Chris, to be able to sit down and have these catch-ups.
mhm. And there I've had experiences before, um, and it truly doesn't even matter what generation someone is from, really. I see this across the board, all generations, right?
Yes.
It is almost like email or instant messaging is a way out of conversations. I've had
Yes.
to say, "You need to pick up the phone and give them a call. You need to get on
Yes.
a Teams message or on a Zoom with them, face to face, seriously, face to face." And they're like, "I don't wanna talk to them." And I'm like, "But you have to." And there is so much lost in translation, I believe, in written form sometimes. It can be taken out of context. I've had someone say, "You were being indirect," and I was like, "I was actually being very direct." But where does that become disjointed? And I do believe that ultimately, I give things 2 emails. If we're not understanding each other after 2 email exchanges, we gotta look at each other. We gotta hear the tone in each other's voices because it is such a waste of time to do that and and ineffective. But there are so many people that I find especially now more than before, that they're like, I'd rather just send them an email
Mm.
and not talk to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where does that come from? I love talking to people. I have a
Yeah.
podcast. I love talking to people.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. It surprises me how often I have to say, pick up the phone and give them a call.
Absolutely. I think it's amazing, and I agree. And, we have all of this. I was having a conversation last night with a group of people at dinner, and we were talking about, I don't know what generation X, Y, whatever it is.
Hmm.
Anyway, they were saying, oh, well, young people now, they're different. And I said, they're no different to, our parents criticized us. So people are people, right? And I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of damage that was done in the 80s and 90s. We had all these seminars on how to treat Generation X and Y as if there's come people from another planet. They're just everyone's human being. And what I find interesting is that younger people who are exposed to my way of thinking, they actually really enjoy it. They actually enjoy the interaction once they understand what it's all about. So it's a myth to suggest that, younger people just want to be sitting there in front of technology. The only reason they're doing that is because they don't know any other way and their boss is doing the same thing. So, all of these things are mitigating against us. But if you think about it, once upon a time, we were sitting around a campfire talking to each other. It's no different, is it really? It's a different conversation that we're talking about now. I mean, I have to give you an example that I found fascinating. We had two engineers working together, very technically competent, and the only thing that separated them was a petition. They were kind of facing each other, but there's a petition. They're working on this multidisciplinary project, a major project in Australia, and there were 27 people on the project, of which two of them were sitting face to face with the petition, and one of them was really upset with the other person. They thought they were unprofessional and all the rest of it. And guess what they did? Amazing. Tapped out an email. The person's just sitting there, like tapped out an email, one paragraph, two paragraphs, three paragraphs about how uh, unprofessional, how annoying this person is to work with. And then just before he clicked the send button, he thought, in the interest of transparency, I should copy in the other 25 people on the project. Wow. So he copied everyone in. So thinking about transparency, click. Now, the outcome of that. It wasn't pretty. It was not
Mm.
good.
Drama. Hmm.
This is a good example. This goes on all over the world all the time. And that's why I'm suggesting that if we can create a culture of conversation where we're actually talking about these things, it sends a clear message to that engineer and to everybody else that's interested that pick up the phone, go and talk to the person, fire up the Zoom call, whatever you need to do, talk about it. Don't just sit there and I think the reason that people are doing it, it comes back to my original point. They do it because they want to be accountable. It's sort of like covering your backside. I don't know what you use that term, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
I'm going to cover my backside. So if I send this email off and anything goes wrong, I will I won't be blamed because I've raised this issue. You see, so this is this risk averse culture that we're in right now, where systems, processes, and procedures are everything. And so this permeates into the way we communicate. So obviously, if that engineer was upset with the other engineer, the key thing would be to go and find a room, go and have a coffee and talk it out. And, I, the whole, you can imagine the project was derailed after that, right? That was a really costly mistake. That happens all over the world every day where people are sending emails when they just talk to the other person. But that won't happen, and this is my point, that won't happen unless the leader has regular catch-ups and conversations with their team members on their own development. Then people go, oh, okay, my leader's big on conversation. Maybe I should talk to that person and pull them aside and have a discussion about what I don't like and all the rest of it. So, yeah, it all starts with the leader's attitude about conversation and their willingness to have a regular catch up with their team member and talk about their own development. I think, look, people say, well, what do I talk about? Well, here's a simple example. You could say to the person, on a scale of 1 to 10, ten's high, one's low, how would you rate your job satisfaction? Now, obviously, job satisfaction ebbs and flows depending, of course, on what's happening during the course of a day. We understand that. But let's say the person said 6. Then you say, why? I've opened a doorway up to an interesting conversation. And the person might say, oh, some days I, have difficulty, but, at the end of the day, it's a 6. And then you say, do you think it could ever go from a 6 to a 7? Because sometimes 6 is as good as it gets in people's minds. That works, I work to live to work, or whatever the saying is. So I don't really see it as a 7. I see it as a 6. So that if they do say, I believe it can go from a 6 to a 7, the leader can then say, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to do to help you go from a 6 to a 7? Except, not necessarily more pay, but, what can I do? That's a good conversation. That wouldn't happen normally. And I'll guarantee that the leader will walk away with some insight that they did not have previously. And I will guarantee that the employee will feel better about talking about that. That's what I'm talking about. It's not about being clever. It's just about being conversational.
Right. And those conversations can be very, very meaningful because in the more frequent they are, by the way, I believe that the more frequent they are, the shorter they get.
Mm.
Right? It's a catch up, right? It's
Absolutely.
it's let's catch up on what's going on. How are you doing? The more frequently you do that, the less surprises you end up with, right? Because there's that continuity of I know what's going on with you. I mean, I historically I'll do weekly one-on-ones. I have people that have said, I'm not interested in one-on-ones. Well, guess what? When we have a one-on-one, it's a really long one because it festers inside of them, whatever it is that they've been wanting to say. And so I find that the frequency
Yeah.
helps the length of the conversation and just how much more effective it is. And, based on what you just said, you also are able to find you can merge interests with talents. I
Yes.
I do believe you do so much better in the things you're interested in. You
100%.
know, oddly, my trade is accounting, and it's what I don't like doing.
Yes.
For my own self, right? For myself, it's
Yeah.
just kinda that thing I don't like doing. I don't know why, but merging interests with talents is really important. Let's move into performance evaluations because when you
Yes.
and I had a meet and greet, we had a lot to say about performance evaluations. I'm not a big fan.
Well, you're looking at someone that wrote a book on it called The End of the Performance Review.
Yep.
And I wrote that in 2013. And I had some impact because people started thinking if we have these regular dialogues, we don't have to have a performance review, which is ultimately what I'm about. But what I found interesting is that we've now moved back to the performance review. In a lot of organizations have gone back to it. It's
Mhm.
ridiculous. There's no research anywhere in the world that I have come across that demonstrates that performance reviews increase performance. So the question is, well, why are we doing it then? I mean, what is the point if it doesn't increase performance? So it's a ridiculous exercise. And if I challenge anybody about why we have to have them, they don't have a good answer. So it's a ridiculous thing. And the other side of it is, Chris, who who enjoys it? Well, HR don't enjoy it because they've got to down tools and organise all these meetings. the manager dreads it because they're not used to having regular catch-ups with their team members.
Mm-hmm.
And the employee dreads it because sometimes they think that their remuneration depends on how they perform in the performance review. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a silly it's an exercise of futility. So if you have
Mm-hmm.
these regular dialogues throughout the year, as you said, there's no surprise. There is no surprise. We understand. Because if I sit down and have a performance review, let's say I've got a performance review and I want to give someone feedback about something that happened 6 months ago. The bottom line is, one, that blindsides the person on the receiving end because they've never heard it before, so that's not good news. Secondly, it has no impact whatsoever because the person at the receiving end's thinking, well, if you really think that was important, they're not saying it, but they're thinking it. If you really think that was important, why didn't you say that 6 months ago? You see, so the immediacy's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all this paperwork. I've seen people doing performance reviews that they don't even make eye contact with each other. It's all about filling out the forms. And what's the point of this? And I'm a strong believer that we need to move well away from this. It's actually holding us back, not taking us forward.
I'd agree with that. In a situation where you have two performance evaluations a year, right? So 6 months apart,
Yeah,
to surprise someone at a semi-annual evaluation with some not not great feedback is kind of like saying, I allowed you, because I do believe leaders have a responsibility to their people. It's almost like delivering the news of, I've allowed you to make mistakes for 6 months. You've operated thinking you were okay
yeah,
because no one called your attention to it. And surprise, now I have a performance evaluation that has completely discouraged me, that makes me afraid for my job. I just don't see how that's anywhere near being as effective as one-on-ones. No one likes that surprise. And now that person's probably not going to work as well as their potential would actually allow them to. I can see how that would be discouraging. As a manager, though, it was something that was a little dreadful when I worked at places where the evals were very long. Obviously, once I was in if I was in an HR position, I would change that up a little bit
yeah,
just
yeah.
to shorten it. But I've even worked in cultures where it was, you never give anyone a 5. So it's like a 1 to 5. Nobody gets a 5,
The
because if they
stories.
get a 5, if you give them a 5, they'll have an inflated sense of self.
Yeah,
And I'm thinking, if they deserve a 5, they get a 5,
100%. And
you
what does a
know?
five actually mean? See, this is the point. When you give people a rating, apart from the
Mhm,
fact that you want to play it safe, so people, if it's a
mhm,
1 to 5 and you give them a 3 because you don't want to, you know, rock the boat, what does that actually mean, for heaven's sake? I mean, and this whole idea. Look, the best analogy I can use, because I'm a gym junkie, I go to the gym regularly, and if I had a trainer, I don't have a trainer, but if I had a trainer and I've got two trainers, one actually walks around the gym with me and gives me feedback about my technique on this machine and on that. So there's one option. But the other option is someone stands at the door and then they give me a rating as I walk out of the gym on my workout. Well, which am I going to choose? It's no brainer, isn't it? So leaders have got to see themselves as coaches, not evaluators. Leaders need to see themselves as performance developers, not appraisers. And the other problem with the rating system, apart from the fact that people don't always rate people and the right way and whatever, is as soon as I rate someone, I have made myself accountable, that is the leader, for their performance. What about the person on the receiving end? Why aren't they accountable for their performance? In other words, I hope I get a good rating today rather than have I done the right thing or not or whatever. So the big issue in the workplace now that I've noticed is that how do we get employees to be more accountable for their performance rather than the manager? I mean, ultimately, the manager's accountable for a team's performance. I understand that.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, how do we actually get people to be, accountable? It comes back to my point about leaders in the business of asking questions rather than answering questions. So, for example, if I said this, I said, Chris, what did you do well in this report? So you've written a report for me. I'm not going to sit there and evaluate. I'm going to ask you, what did you think you did well in this report? Right. So I'm getting some positives. Let's start with an upward spiral of positivity rather than a downward spiral of negativity. Second question I'm going to ask you is what didn't go so well? There's always things that can be improved. I want you to acknowledge those things. And the third question is, when you write the next report, what will you do differently next time? You see, I've asked these questions and I've made you completely accountable for that performance. Now that happens in catch-ups. It doesn't happen in performance reviews. So that's the kind of style of thing that I'm talking about that makes a massive difference.
I'd agree with that. Um, Again, not a huge fan of performance evaluations. I think I'm so thankful for a lot of the leaders and coaches and mentors I've had along the way, because that's how I develop my own style, and I've seen who I worked well with and why, right? Who was the best at pushing me, even in their own directness, um, and who was not. And I've
Yeah.
tried to, I always say you learn from the good and the bad, right? You learn from
Absolutely.
the good how you want to be, right? You look at them and you're like, okay, that's the goat. That's the kind of leader I want to be like. And then the ones that you look at and you're like, I'd never treat people that way, or I would never, and ultimately a lot of those things led me to opening my own practice, because I kind of got tired of being told how to manage my own people, because
Yes.
I mean, I'm not excellent, I'm not like the best at it, but I put a lot of thought and energy into it, and, trying to pull out people's maximum potential out of them, because
Yeah.
it's good for them and me. I won't say it's not selfish also, but it's
Sure.
good for everyone when you can do that. The conversations are good.
Yep.
You learn from your direct reports all the time. That's another thing that I'm a big fan of, and I just don't see that. It's funny because you're on the other side of the world, but USHR, I see that it needs to get better.
Yes.
What would you say the departments should be called? Not human
Oh, well,
resources, but
look, I was sort of at the forefront of being critical of the term human resources and suggested that people call it people and culture. And look, I don't care what people label it as, but I think the derogatory term is human resources. People and culture is probably a better way of putting it, and I find a lot of places have changed as a result of that. That's critically that's a good way of actually capturing what it's about. But coming back to your point, and I think there's probably some listeners and viewers who are probably thinking, yes, this is all very great, but what's one of the barriers from a leader's point of view? And you asked the question earlier. The question going to the heart of this is, why are you leading someone? Why are you in a position of leadership? Not because I got promoted, obviously, that's very straightforward. But I think there's a brilliant provocative question that I ask everybody in one of my coaching sessions. Why should anyone be led by you? Now, that's a great question, because if the other
Mhm.
person can't answer that, then I can guarantee to you that nobody in the team will be able to answer that about the leader, right? But that's a good question. So I would challenge anyone who's in a leadership role listening to this today is to actually ponder the question, why should anyone be led by you? Because it's a good question. And if you can't answer that, then your focus isn't correct. I mean, so some of the answers might be, well, why should anyone be led by me? Because um, I I am into developing people. I want to leave my people better off when I leave than when I started, or I'm here to improve systems and processes, or I'm here to create a better customer experience. Whatever the thing is, if I can't answer that, then I shouldn't be entitled to being in that leadership role. So there's two types of leaders: those that see it as a privilege and those that see it as an entitlement. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that get promoted and they see it as an entitlement. Now, if I feel entitled to being a leader, am I going to sit down and have these regular catch-ups? Probably not, because, I'm the leader, I decide what happens and all the rest. If I see leadership as a privilege, I'm more likely to be a servant leader. I'm more likely to be somebody who is in service of my team. But it all goes to the heart of why should anyone be led by you, which is a great question to ask yourself, I think, in a leadership role.
I would say that that is excellent advice because I know that in recruiting managers that would report to me, I would ask the question when they'd say, "I'm looking to manage." My question is always, "Are you looking to manage the work or are you looking to manage the people?" Because there's a big difference. And I
Yeah.
think that if you're a doer, you can be the manager of work.
Mm,
But as the person who's doing the recruiting, I think that that response would be very telling as to what would be a fit for that candidate. But I love how you say, why should anyone want to be led by you?
yeah,
Because that is truly, are you leading the troops into battle? Why would they listen to you?
great.
And that is a really, I want to use it. I'm gonna borrow that too because I think that that's a great way to look at it. I know what you're talking about when you say that, someone may perceive it as being an entitlement. I tend to think of promotions in that, right? Like rite of passage.
Yeah,
I'm next up for this role. This
yeah.
would be my next role. And I don't know that that is always the correct and proper way to be promoting people.
Mm,
I think you have to look at everything, the people, the work, and I always say I don't think it's ever the work and always the people because without, going to what we're even talking about, it's the people
yeah,
at the end of the day that are going to make things happen.
yeah. And I don't think anyone listening to this would think that I'm talking about being soppy and all that sort of stuff. It's not about being soppy. It's actually about being authentic. And at the end
True.
of the day, authenticity pays off big time. And, you know, what more authentic thing can you do than to sit down with your direct report and have a conversation about their development? There's nothing that could be more authentic than that in terms of leadership. So it really is about that, and authenticity is not a technique. People often, oh well, I've got to go and learn to be authentic. Well, just be authentic is not a bad start. So how do you do this? You have your regular catch-ups. You take your people into consideration, but you also can have the hard conversations with people because you've got a good foundation to work from, a foundation based on mutual respect and trust. So, it's not all about just being nice to people and pleasant to deal with, although a bit more of that wouldn't hurt. But it's more than that. It's a much bigger thing than that. It's recasting the employment relationship and therefore changing the culture within your team. And as I've said to you earlier, if every leader in every organization had regular catch ups, uh, there's not going to be a culture problem. See, the solution's so easy, it's so elusive, but yet it's so out of sight because some leaders just don't have the right understanding of why they're there and what their role is and all that kind of thing. So it does come back. I think it comes back to what's in between people's ears as to why I'm in this leadership role.
Definitely. Tim, where can we find you?
You can go to my website, www.winnersatwork.com.au, or I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I'd love to engage with people if they choose to. So just type in Dr. Tim Baker on LinkedIn, and I'll be there. And if you'd like to connect with me, I'm happy to do that.
Well, I think that our conversation has been incredible. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. It's great advice. That's what we're hoping to do is help people live their best lives. And, we can either be speaking to leaders or people who want to be leaders. And I think this was really, really great advice that you shared today. And people can find you online and your 18 books. You've got one in process right now,
That's
correct?
right.
Are
Yes.
Did I hear you do 2 a year? You can do 2 a year? Is that what?
Yeah, yeah. Someone says, "Oh, how do you do all that?" Well, there's no magic to it. It's just getting up early, 5 to 7. You write, and you're done. It's that easy and that hard, depending on which way you
Yeah,
want to look at it. So, it's a labor of love for me. So that's for sure. But Chris, I've really enjoyed our conversation too. I think you brought
definitely.
the best out of me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for being part of our first wave. It is your time and your energy is very much appreciated. You have wonderful things to offer, and I'd like to be part of helping you with that as well. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Cheers.
Thanks.